Hello and welcome to episode 5 of Hogging the Mic, the Boar's official podcast bringing you student journalism like you've never heard it before. And also, welcome to the new academic year. Whether you're heading to Warwick for the first time or heading back for your final year, we hope you enjoy this episode.
In our bonus episode this week, we'll not only be shining a light on our freshers print, but also bringing you a conversation with a Boar alumni who's gone on to work at two of the UK's leading Sunday newspapers.
But before that interview, we're going to spotlight all things print edition.
Now, for those of you who are new to the Boar, our print editions are sort of the pinnacle to the work that we do here. So as well as our online content, we publish 6 print editions throughout the year. The editors pitch, writers submit their articles, and the team lay it up and turn it into the prints, which are distributed across campus.
And our first print edition of the academic year and of the new volume of the Boar is out next week, and we're going to be spotlighting a few articles from it today.
Our freshers print includes loads of articles all about Warwick, including guides on how to get into a variety of different societies and also information about what you can find around campus. So make sure you pick up your copy at the Freshers Fair and around campus over Freshers Week. We've decided to spotlight a few of our favourite pieces, so let's start with the culture sections.
So the culture section has had tons and tons of really great articles dedicated towards freshers and the freshers experience. A lot of the culture sections, such as music and travel, have really spotlighted the different societies that Warwick has to offer. So I'm actually going to be spotlighting 2 articles from the 2 sections there, music and travel. So for music, we have an honourable mention, which is Kira Flynn's Welcome to Warwick Bandstock, where campus comes alive with music, where Kira has been in touch with members of Warwick Bandstock, got different quotes from them, and you can read all about what this really great society has to offer. Warwick Bandstock is so welcoming and open to so many different musicians. So if music is something that you're interested in, this is definitely one to get yourself down to for Freshers Week and get involved in. However, the article I would like to spotlight is Ivana Keen's Explore the World Without Leaving Campus. This is from the travel section. So in this article, Ivana goes through the different travel societies that are at Warwick, which include language societies such as Italian, French, Spanish, and German, as well as Warwick Language Society as a whole, and also the different societies that offer like expeditions such as Warwick D.V. Society. So there's so much there to get involved in, and I'm sure there is something that you can find that interests you if you are somebody who enjoys languages or travel or just exploring in general.
Speaking of societies, the sports section article that I've chosen to spotlight is Megan Green's article, Sports Societies at Warwick, Here's Why You Should Join Our Clubs. This article includes a variety of Warwick sports clubs who have offered a brief introduction to what they do, what they offer, and how you can get involved. There are lots of other really good articles in the sports section, including a guide to all the on-campus sports facilities, news stories about new partnerships that the university clubs have made and awards that they have won. So if you're interested in sport at uni, definitely pick up a copy and give all of them a read.
And over in the news section, we've also got lots more stories about what's happening on campus, what's been happening around the university and the local area over the summer. So we've got lots of articles, including one on the new Safe Zone app, which is intended to keep people safer on campus. We've got an article about Leamington being ranked the second best city, or the second most underrated city. So that's a really good one to read if you want to explore the town that you'll probably be spending lots of your time at when you're at Warwick. And we've also got some longer features about universities and their financial problems. So that's obviously a big topic that's being in the news at the minute. So definitely check that one out. And we've also got a feature about graduate prospects and what's in store for Warwick graduates after they graduate. So there are some features from the news article. news section, but the article I'm actually going to spotlight this week is from the opinion section, which is a change up from usual. But it's an article by Josh Mansley called Warwick Nightlife from Casbah Mondays to Smack Saturdays. So, of course, when you're coming to Warwick, when you're starting a new university, nightlife will often be on your mind as the thing that you want to know all about. So check out Josh's article and you'll be able to read all about which nightclubs you should check out in Coventry, Leamington and on campus, and what events you should be heading to. So definitely check out Josh's article.
Don't forget, you can read all those stories and a lot more in our Freshers print, which you'll be able to pick up across campus throughout Freshers Week, including at Freshers Fair, which is on Wednesday, the 1st of October. At the fair, the Boar will be manning a stall all day. So if you want to ask any questions about the paper or how to get involved or pick up a copy of Freshers print, then make sure you head over there and speak to some of our exec members.
Or alternatively, if you're not around on campus or you're an alumni tuning into the podcast, then all the articles from the print will be available on our website and on our AnyFlip page in the coming weeks.
But now let's move on to our interview for today, which is with a Boar alumni that has gone on to hold roles at some of the UK's biggest national newspapers.
This alumna spoke to us about how influential the Boar was in her journey and shared lots of stories about all that she's done since.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy listening to our chat with Rebecca Myers.
Today's guest started out at the Boar as books editor in 2012 before working through the ranks to become deputy editor-in-chief and eventually editor-in-chief in 2014. After graduating from Warwick, she earned a place on the highly competitive Sunday Times grad scheme and worked at the paper for 7 years, mainly paving the way for female journalists covering women's sport. She's now deputy news editor and acting national news editor for The Observer. Rebecca Myers, welcome to Hogging the Mic.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Very happy to have you here. We're going to start off with a question that we ask everyone that we interview. So what drew you to the Boar when you first started at Warwick?
I have to say, I think about this a lot because it was literally like the first thing I did when I arrived. I remember going to the fair with all the different stalls of like societies to get involved in and just walking straight up to the poor people who were on the Boar stall at the time and being like, I want to write, I want to do whatever I can. How can I get involved? And in hindsight, I think it's quite interesting because I didn't necessarily know I wanted to be a journalist at that point. I'd written a bit. I think writing was what really drew me. And I'd written a bit for my school magazine, which was like a really small publication we just put out once. And I think that had really given me a bug of like, how can I get involved? How can I do more? And then, as you say, I started out as books editor, sort of as soon as I could, tried to get involved and wrote as much as I could. And that the rest is history, really. I am, as many people who do the Boar find out, that you tend to spend almost as much time, if not maybe a bit more sometimes, as you do on your actual degree.
Yeah, I had a very similar story of just finding them at Freshers Fair and then just latching on and never leaving. So you mentioned that your first role within the editorial team was books editor. So even in your first role, you weren't afraid to bring new initiatives to the section and to the paper as a whole. You coordinated a project with Penguin to produce a compilation of 50 individual writers' snippet book reviews. So what was it that inspired you to start this project? And do you think new projects like this one, like Hogging the Mic, are important in student media like the Boar?
I think they're so important, especially these days. So, gosh, I was books editor maybe 14 years ago, probably. And the world is in very, different place than it was then already. And there's just so much competition out there for people's attentions. And I think I was sort of aware, even at that stage, that like the more you could do to present things in a slightly new way or offer slightly new things to readers, could only be a good thing. And that's even truer for you and your teams now, because you're up against not just other newspapers, other student publications, but also everything on someone's phone. So things like this, a podcast, video formats, sort of anything you can do to bring your journalism to people in a different way, I think is always a positive thing. And the book section was a really interesting first challenge because obviously book sections tend to be quite traditional, often like reviews led. And that project, it just struck me I remember Penguin got in touch to say that, you know, they had this book coming out. They thought it was going to be a really big deal. It turned out, you know, many years later, it is still, it's Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's still talked about, you know, very, very much. It was a very big deal. And it struck me at the time, kind of, rather than asking one person to do that review, what if we just gave the book to as many of our, you know, reviewers, of our writers as possible, and got all those different takes. And yeah, and I think always thinking about how you can innovate and how you can present something slightly differently, whether that's in print or on a website, on an app, etc., is always a positive thing as a journalist.
And also, in addition to those projects, when you went on to become deputy editor, you worked on a lot of different stories, and I'm sure you'll touch upon those in a minute. One of those was Bragate, which I'm sure you'll expand upon, and that was picked up by several national papers, including The Independent and the Daily Mail. Like I said, I know that wasn't the only story you worked on that gained national attention, but what was it like to work on these stories that gained national press attention? And do you think this shows the importance of student media in amongst all the journalistic landscape?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, there were kind of several stories, and I think there still often are stories that get picked up by the national press. The most sort of notable that stands out to me actually from that time was also some protests that took place that were, you know, we had press, you know, national press coming to campus for those, and you have a real sense in that moment of, oh gosh, it's bigger than I thought. But of course, student life is of interest to, you know, to anyone, and it's of importance to the whole country. And it's interesting, I think the first time that happens, getting a sense of things being picked up, I think it's just making sure that you're doing the kind of best reporting that you possibly can, the best editing that you can as a team. When I was deputy, I was sort of the most junior one on that team, and I was very lucky to be surrounded by some absolutely brilliant journalists who were a couple of years above me at the university, and you know, who really guided me in kind of editing and reporting on things. And I was, you know, a lot of them are now working in the national press, which is great. So it's kind of learning, I think, from people, you know, more senior than you at the paper. And also it was, you know, often we were in touch with, like those protests I mentioned, I was then in touch with national journalists who came to campus, and it was a nice moment of thinking, well, my reporting's not so different from yours, actually, even though I'm starting out. We're both here trying to, you know, report on these protests in the best possible way. So that's always really heartening, I think. And I think also just making sure, you know, that your paper looks at the whole, you know, what's the word, the sort of the full richness of student life, and it's not always just the kind of stories that you think are going to cut through, but often offering, you know, just the perspective of the people who you know, who are your readers, who are your writers as well, is really important.
And do you think as well that gave you a buzz for going into journalism as well, having that national coverage and seeing that it was more beyond student papers, and that those stories were making an impact nationally as well?
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, part of that was getting the opportunity to occasionally work alongside national reporters. But also I think, you know, I tried to write as much as I could while I was working with the Boar and while I was at uni for lots of different publications. So in those times, it was the Huffington Post was like the big place that you could write, because they took pictures, particularly on comment, from kind of anyone. And it was a really great way to learn and to just basically practice as much as possible. And it gave me, I think, a hunger the more, and it was, I guess also it was kind of early days of Twitter, which is like obviously not what it was. But it gives you a sense of like, oh, I can have a real impact with the reporting I do, or with the comment pieces I do. I remember everything that happened with Charlie Hebdo happened when I was editor-in-chief, I think. And, you know, we took that really seriously. We talked about like how as a paper we were going to cover that, and what we felt as a paper. And it's a sort of microcosm of what your life will be like if you do join a national newspaper as well. I think it's always worth remembering, like, you're making a lot of the same decisions as people on national newspapers make, obviously in a smaller setting with a smaller readership, but it's really important to people, and it matters to the local community and to the student community.
You spoke there about making those big decisions on covering really serious topics. You've always had an interest in journalism and covering quite bold topics, your first article being why we should use the word feminist. Additionally, whilst at Warwick, you hosted a show on Raw Radio at Warwick called Raising the Bra, which you describe as similar to Radio 4's Women's Hour. Would you say that amplifying the female voice in the media is something that you've always been passionate about?
Yes, I should say I'd like it to have been like Women's Hour. I think that was a little bit, I wouldn't dare say it was. Exactly. But yeah, it's something I'm really, really passionate about. As you say, the first piece of journalism I ever wrote was in defense of the word, using the word feminist to describe myself and my schoolmates at school. It's hugely important to me. I think my whole life I've been kind of shocked by how far we still have to go. At the moment, I'm in my 30s now, and I sometimes think I'd be really disheartened if I saw the world now when I was 15, because I think I would have really thought it would have come a lot further than it has. But it's really, really important to me, and journalism it's getting a lot better, but it's nowhere near a fully equal industry at all. There's a lot of disparities. There's a lot of work still to do. When I started out in the national newsroom, there were like 2 women in the newsroom. And by the time I left the Sunday Times 9 years later, we were an all-female news desk. So there were no female news editors. And then by the time I was on the news desk, there were no male news editors. Actually, there was an investigations editor who was part of our team. But yeah, the day-to-day kind of news editing was all done by women, which was extraordinary. And I think that still is a real rarity. I don't really think there's anywhere else in Fleet Street, in the national press that had that. So there's a lot of work still to do, but simultaneously covering kind of women's issues through reporting, so particularly women's health issues. I know we'll probably come to women's sport at some point, which is my other area, but yeah, covering women's issues, and then also I think within journalism making sure that women are foregrounded and getting and making progress through a challenging industry.
I think that leads us on nicely to talking about your work experience placements, because you managed to secure a placement with Yasmin Alibi-Brown at the Independent and at the Daily Mail, as well as interning at the BBC. So firstly, it's kind of a 2-part question. How did you go about securing work experience placements such as these ones? And secondly, how did working in these newsrooms, these huge newsrooms, set you up for a career in journalism?
Yeah, so I had no idea how to get work experience anywhere. I will say that. I had no contacts, no knowledge of what on earth to do. And I remember I emailed the BBC host to I don't know if they still do it. I'm guessing they probably do, but they run work experience from sort of anyone and everyone from like an 8-year-old, well, maybe not quite 8, but very, very young, just for the day, just to kind of pop in and see what it's all like, all the way through to 2-week placements for people at university. And so I applied. I said I was interested in kind of basically a lot of the like news and documentary side of things, and then I didn't hear for ages, and then one day I got an email out the blue saying we've got a slot this summer. It was university holidays. Do you want to come in and do some work experience? And I was like, yeah, I'd love to. I actually at the moment work around the corner from the BBC offices, and I went into the Cafe Nero the other day where I sat before that first day, and I just remember feeling like I was going to be sick. I was so nervous, but I got really lucky. I joined an amazing team in documentary development, in current affairs, who were just like fantastic journalists, working on kind of documentaries for BBC 2, BBC 3, working ideas up, reporting, researching, and after a couple of weeks they said, well, we can't keep you on for longer than 2 weeks, like that's our policy, but do you want to join as a freelancer, and we'll pay you. And I stayed for I think pretty much most of the rest of the summer, and then I came back a few months later when I had university holidays, and stayed in touch for a very long time, and I loved it. It was wonderful. So that was a sort of, I think, lucky in the sense that the opportunity then did come up once the application was in, but I think just taking that moment and just running with it. And then the work experience with Yasmin, again, I was at an event feminism event, no one will be surprised to hear, called Women of the World, which is a wonderful event, still running. And there was a sort of women's views on the news panel, and I asked a question. I think it was sort of about keeping true to your feminist values and working in the media. and she said, "Oh, come talk to me afterwards if you have any more questions." And I went up to her afterwards and had a chat. And she said, "Well, look, I sometimes look to work with, young reporters if you want to do some work experience with me." I was like, "Oh my God, that would be amazing." And so I worked with her, just her on a couple of pieces, and she really gave me an amazing break, and I'm so grateful for that. So yeah, I think a lot of the work experience I ended up getting was just it's just trying, and like I said, sometimes you don't hear for a really long time, but when I then got a foot in the door, it was just like, how can I stay? How can I make myself useful? What can I do?
I think we talked a lot already about your time in journalism, and for people listening, that has all happened while you were at Warwick, all that work experience, all the time at the Boar. So we haven't touched upon the Boar loads, but I feel we have really covered your time before going into the workplace. So after Warwick, you then went on to do the Sunday Times graduate scheme, which is a route that many people still aspire to apply for. How did you decide to go down the graduate scheme route when some people go down, say, the master's route? And what was the process like for you to get on this scheme?
Yeah, so I wasn't really sure exactly what to do once I graduated. I wasn't I didn't really kind of feel financially in the position to do the masters, but I was looking at the NCTJ, the kind of the shorter qualification, which I've heard lots of brilliant things about, and I actually sort of signed up and had a place to do it. But I thought I'll throw my hat into the ring at these grad schemes as well, put some applications in and see what happens. And then I got a letter through the post saying, we'd like to interview for the Sunday Times one, which was a bit sort of like pinch me. And then I got it, which I really wasn't expecting. And actually, speaking of kind of the Boar and what it did for me, the final stage. So I had there was a sort of big day of interviews and workshops and a test. And then this final stage was an interview with the editor-in-chief. And it said, bring your portfolio in. And I sort of thought, oh God, I don't even know if I have a portfolio. What's a portfolio? So I just bought a load of copies of the Boar, because I was editing at the time. I'd obviously done stuff for the Boar my whole time at university. And so I bought in all the recent copies I sort of had kicking around the office, and was able to talk about, stories we'd covered. And at the time we were doing kind of poster fronts, which felt very radical at the time, or like we were using graphics on the front and doing sort of slightly different things. We were just launching an app for the first time, and it just gave me so much to talk about. And I remember him saying to me, very sort of generously saying, like, this is very much like what we do at a national paper. You're making a lot of the same calls and decisions, and we were laying out the paper ourselves. So then I got on the grad scheme, and it was an amazing thing. It's 2 years, and they sent me kind of all the way around the paper. So by the time I left the Sunday Times, I had written for every single section of the paper. Although the only article I ever wrote for business was about how much I loved Marks and Spencer's clothes, which probably doesn't quite count. It was an amazing training for that reason, because you did news and you did kind of obviously reporting, but you also wrote for money and wrote for travel, and also wrote for sport, which ended up being an unexpected path I then took when I came off the grad scheme.
You spoke there about writing for sport. When you began working at the Sunday Times, you were on the sports desk. You were also the only female working on that desk. I personally do a lot of stuff for women's sport platforms, and still there's mainly men doing that. So what was your experience like as a woman working in an area of journalism which is pretty male dominated?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, it has got better, but it is still the most male dominated part of, I think, pretty much any paper. I wasn't expecting that, I suppose. I was quite surprised by how few women there were in the press box when I turned up to matches, things like that. There were some, and still are, some amazing, incredible, trailblazing women. And particularly the Sunday Times team was smaller, but the Times side, now they're a kind of 7-day operation team, and there are some amazing women who've written for the Times for many, many years on sport and really trailblazed. And equally, women's football. When I first came in, sort of no one was really covering certainly like the league in the UK. We just come off the back of the World Cup at that point. It must have been 20. I'm gonna get my dates wrong. I think it was 2015. And the Sunday Times had covered that, which in itself was sort of trailblazing. But yeah, there was no one doing this sort of day to day really, and I was kind of, obviously in a feminist way, was like, oh, that's outrageous, I want to do this. And I had a wonderful editor who I owe a lot to, who just really supported me to do that and let me run with it, and was like, you want to do women's sport, you own women's sport. But equally said to me, you know, you can write whatever you want, don't feel pigeonholed to do women's sport just because you're a woman. So he was immensely supportive. And I also took over the Sunday Times Sportswoman of the Year awards. I worked alongside the guy who ran those for a couple of years, and then I ended up running it myself for a couple of years. And again, that's been going for like 37 years or something now. They'll kick me for getting it wrong. I'm a veteran of the awards and I can't remember, but it's more than 30 years. And that's extraordinary when you think how few people are, how little coverage there still is of women's sport today, to have done that at a time when literally no one was doing it, is really, really amazing. But there's still, like you said, there's still a huge amount to do. There's still a very long way to come. There's still a disparity in, the prominence given to coverage of women's sport, but also the kind of, we've just seen with the Euros this incredible moment. But I was in the pub, nowadays I just watch as a fan. I don't do sport coverage anymore, but I was in the pub and I sort of couldn't believe my eyes, because I still can't get my head around the fact that people care like that. When I was at the Women's World Cup in 2019, and we were like astounded that there were like fans turning up and people were paying so much attention. It's just come on, leaps and bounds since then.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how far women's sport has come, and obviously the coverage of the Lionesses at the Euros was absolutely massive. Do you think that changes still need to be made to increase the coverage of women's sport as a whole? And if so, how do you think national papers or even student papers can go about doing that?
Yeah, definitely. I used to talk a lot about this sort of vicious circle of basically, lack of coverage means fewer fans, because they don't know it's out there, they don't know how to access it, which means, less funding, less, money coming through the gates, which means the product suffers, which means less coverage. And it's just this kind of constant self-fulfilling cycle. And I used to really argue when I was covering it full time for, we have to break that. We have to break that cycle. And it's not always easy. Sport is a massive part of journalism. It's a huge part of the industry, and there's so much to cover all the time. Let alone, even just the Premier League, you could fill a paper with just the Premier League at any point. But I think for me, it was always about telling the stories in a different way. So really looking at like interesting human stories. The real gift of women's football, especially when I was starting out doing it, was that, these were not like super media trained kind of guys who wouldn't say anything like the men's footballers. Interviewing the men's footballers could be so boring, because they're just really media trained. They don't want to give you any time. Increasingly, you're seeing very, very big sports stars go and sort of cut the press out. They don't need them. They speak to their fans directly via Instagram. Whereas women's football was this incredible territory of like, women who'd worked 2 jobs or like washed the kit to get on the pitch, and just had these amazing hinterlands, really fascinating. Or they were like trained lawyers, and then they also played for Arsenal or whatever. And I just thought, God, this is such a gift as a journalist. These interviews are just so fascinating. So at first it was definitely just almost approaching it in a slightly different way. I think certainly as student journalists, like the really powerful thing you can do is just give it equal coverage, like as a kind of ballpark, because you also your sports coverage won't just be like the Premier League, obviously. You have the power to actually, level the playing field from the word go, but also foregrounding the challenges people face. And I think that was really important to me to show the challenges that the women went through trying to get funding. You know, endless discussions still ongoing about like lack of boots for female players, things like that. And that's something that student journalism can do so powerfully, because you can speak so directly to the people who are affected, or who are finding that they're discriminated against. So I think it's got a huge role to play.
Yeah, like I said earlier, I've covered quite a bit of women's sport for some independent sites, but also at the Boar. And I definitely say to any Boar writers or Warwick students watching or listening to this, it's a great way to get involved and get more experience. Like you said, a lot of female athletes are much more willing to interview. We've interviewed, well, personally, I've interviewed some professional footballers, some Paralympians, all for the Boar. So definitely, like, have a look at the sports section and try and get in contact with local female athletes, because they'll definitely be interested in speaking to you.
Definitely. And also, if someone, like, if you're a student journalist and you want to go into being a sport journalist, the advice I would always give people is like, try not to go for the Premier League. Like, every paper's got, you know, so many correspondents you can go and do, like an Arsenal match or a big interview. If you can come in, you know, I did the Tokyo Olympics with the Sunday Times, and I did quite a lot of Paralympic interviews. And if you can do something that other people aren't doing, if you can show all these incredible, amazing stories that are out there, human stories, niche sports, you know, I've done all sorts of weird sports in my time, covering live or previews. And that's actually where a lot of the best stories are. And they're going to be the ones that are most in demand from a desk, because they can call on dozens of correspondents to do Premier League.
And I think that before we move on to your time, your role now, we can circle back nicely from that onto something else you mentioned on your work experience, not your work experience at the Sunday Times, on the grad scheme at the Sunday Times. And you mentioned that you wrote for every section during your time at the paper. We have 16 sections at the Boar, and lots of people try and write for all of these sections. But we often talk about finding your niche in journalism. But do you think, especially in student journalism, that it's important to try your hand at covering as much as possible when you have this opportunity and the space like the Boar to do this?
Definitely. I can't recommend it enough. I think, you know, finding a niche has a value, and certainly, like, I suppose you could say for many years, my sort of niche was just like women's issues and feminism. Not that's quite a large niche, but it does help to have a bit of a kind of sense of what you personally care about or what you most want to report on. But ultimately, you know, I'm quite a good example of the opposite as well, which is that, you know, I spent 4 years doing sport full time, which hadn't even really been a big part of my plan going into the Sunday Times, and then came out and went back into news. So the more you can kind of, you know, spread your wings and try different things, and particularly, like you say, writing for different sections is such a good skill to cultivate. And the more you can do that and practice that, the better, because also if you decide one day to go freelance, perhaps, obviously you're maximizing the amount of money you can earn, because you can write for loads of different sections. So, you know, the money section, I always loved writing for, had a brilliant editor there. And that's not something I would have ever thought to do. Equally, you know, the travel section, like, I got to go to some amazing places to review things because I was up for it and ready to go if they wanted me to. So the more you can practice and write around sections, absolutely the better, I'd say. But equally, if you think, you know, if something's calling to you, and often that is, you know, people want to do news reporting. But again, I say, even to kind of reporters that come onto the grad scheme now, I'm like, try and keep your options and the kind of reporting you're doing quite broad, even if, you know, you start to develop a clear sort of theme of, like, perhaps you're really good at science stories or you really care about that. The more you can do to show an editor, you can kind of turn your hand to anything. No editor's going to be unhappy about that, that's for sure.
So you mentioned there how you've now gone back into a news role. So you're now deputy news editor for The Observer, but you're currently acting as the national news editor as well. So what do these roles involve?
Yeah, so I moved over into news about 3 and a bit years ago. So originally joined the Sunday Times news desk, and I was assistant news editor there, and then moved to The Observer just about 18 months, 2 years ago, and became deputy there. So it's involved all sorts of things. It's been an amazing experience. For a while I covered both foreign and UK news, so sort of anything and everything, with my colleague. And now at the moment I'm looking after just the national news, although in the world we live in, that sort of constantly, involves Trump or Putin or, what's going on in Gaza. So that I wouldn't say there's, strictly speaking, a sort of national section in the way that, maybe there was once. We take a lot of the international news up front in print terms, and obviously the world is a very lively place at the moment. So I have a team of brilliant reporters. Again, a mixture of kind of people who are more like general reporters who do anything and everything, and then some people who have more specific beats, so like technology or home affairs. Amazing politics team, and it's just so a Sunday paper is a bit unique in that we're sort of building up to like one thing a week, one paper, and then the website we try and fill throughout the week as well. But yeah, it's like, so my week is very, very weighted towards Friday, Saturday, not very sociable working hours, unfortunately. So this stage of the week, early on, I'm just trying to I'm talking to the reporters. What are they looking into? What stories are they working on? What ideas do they have? They're reporting it out throughout the week. And then come kind of Friday, Saturday, we're into more like live territory. So looking at the big stories developing, on the day, and how we should be covering those. But for a Sunday paper as well, it's often always about thinking, ahead. How can we make the news, not just kind of report the news? How can we set the agenda? How can we get the exclusives? Because you can't rely on A, things happening on a Saturday, but also B, you can't, you don't want to be late or you look like something's quite old by the time you get to it. So you're always trying to think about setting the agenda.
So you talk about setting the agenda there. What is it that you do to go about making sure you stay on top of things through the week? Is there anything you're doing to keep an eye on those stories?
Yeah, so part of it is having obviously fantastic reporters and they're developing relationships with their contacts. That means that they get the exclusive look at something or the first bite of the apple of a story. But it's also, a lot of it's about forward planning, as one of the editors on the desk. It's about knowing what's coming up in the diary, what things might turn out to be big issues. And I think constantly asking yourself, how could we do this differently? Because we're not bound by the same sort of rhythms of a daily. We don't have to do the kind of this happened yesterday. It's looking at like, what would I want to read on Sunday? Ideally, what would be the one piece that actually I want to read on this? So I'm always thinking of my reader and thinking, if they're only going to sit down and read one piece this week and they really want to understand this issue, what might that piece be? But yeah, you're so, any editor's only as good as their reporters. And I'm incredibly lucky to have worked with some amazing reporters who just have a scent for kind of what to dig into. And a lot of your bread and butter at a Sunday paper is like investigations, which are hard. They take certainly weeks, often months, sometimes years. They take legal work and big risks from a paper and its editor-in-chief. But that's what we thrive off. And we are lucky to be able to give reporters a bit more time at a Sunday paper to dig into stuff. So as an editor as well, for me, it's like balancing when I'm talking to a reporter, what have they got on day to day? And then what are those bigger projects? Like I know that they're working on something for October. So how are they getting on with that? I have to remember to kind of check in and help them with that as well. So, it's a great privilege to be able to do that and not to always feel too sort of sucked into the news cycle. Although, yeah, increasingly with the world as it is, it's quite hard to avoid being sucked into the latest.
You spoke there a bit about preempting kind of what is going to be relevant and what your reader will want to see on the Sunday. That's something that we currently do at the Boar because we print a few times a year, but we pitch for print to our writers a lot earlier. So we have to kind of plan our pitches to make sure that whatever pieces we're getting are still relevant in the weeks later when our paper comes out. Kind of on that note, that's obviously something we're doing now, and hopefully our editors, our exec will go on to work for national papers and maybe do similar roles to you and have to use similar skills. How do you think that student media set you up for working in two of the biggest media outlets in the UK?
It's been kind of everything. It's been amazing. And actually, at one point there were three. I think we all overlapped. There were three former Boar editors at the Sunday Times, which, given that the Sunday Times is smaller than other nationals in the sense that it's a weekly, was quite something. And people were like, "Oh my God, did you do the same student paper?" But it was absolutely transformative for me. I think, taking like control of such an amazing thing and feeling such pride in what we do. I remember one day, like, it had snowed and we had to go to print, and we were like pushing my car through the snow to get to the office to go to print. And my friend who I was living with, who wasn't involved in the paper, was sort of like, why are you doing this? And I was like, because we have to, we care so much about this. But that sets you up so well, I think, for any job in journalism. I think it's an industry. You wouldn't do it if you didn't love it, probably. The hours can be quite random and weird. And, it can be really hard. But I think doing the Boar gave me such a sense of like why things mattered, and what you could give people. And also working with writers, it was such a joy. I mean, obviously your pool is like the whole university, which is absolutely incredible. So working with writers from different backgrounds, certainly now as a journalist, some of the best reporters come from, a couple of reporters I've worked with have incredible science backgrounds, or one I worked with had retrained from medicine, and it's just the more people you can have writing for you, the better. But also I think working with a team is such a vital thing, and all kind of pulling together towards that one thing, particularly like you say, when you have fewer editions. So you really want to make it count. Like, you've put a lot of thought into it. You've started really early, probably thinking about what you want to do and trying to make sure it lasts by the time you go to print. And that feeling of like all pulling together to the final product, that will be something you have every day if you're in a daily, or every week if you're at a Sunday paper, or in a magazine every month, etc. That's such an important skill to cultivate. I think the people skills and the way that you work with other people, you kind of can't, and that's quite a hard thing to practice. You can write as if, during university, you can write for whoever and kind of practice your writing skills, your reporting skills, but actually being on a team like the Boar and kind of pulling together towards that one moment of publication or website is like really something you can't get any other way, I think.
Yeah, I think we can definitely all relate to those stories of doing pretty much anything for the Boar, like spending hours in the office during layup on InDesign, and our friends who aren't involved in the paper thinking we're crazy, but yeah, that's what we do for the paper.
Exactly. But I think once you've done that, that will stand you in such great stead. There isn't anything like that. There's no other practice you can do that makes you feel that way about, and it also gives you that buzz, right? It gives you that love for it. And I think coming in any newsroom with someone new coming in, just clearly loving what they do and being so keen to try what, and report and do all sorts of new things is going to be an asset.
Definitely. So now the next part of our podcast is the quickfire question section. So we have got a list of questions, and just answer them as quickly as you can. Some are related to journalism, some aren't. So yeah, we'll just take it in turns to ask you a question. So the first question, you may be neither of these, but are you a tea person or a coffee person?
I'm both. I am, definitely a coffee person in terms of addiction and getting through the working day, but I love a cup of tea as well.
Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Morning, definitely. I struggle to function in the evening completely. I'm like a child.
Who's your dream interview guest?
Oh, wow, that's really hard. Trying to think quickly on this one. I mean, I'd love to interview Putin. I mean, sort of a left field, but I think if you think dream, thinking of people that it would be almost impossible to get in a room. Yeah, high on the list.
What is one thing you always carry with you as a journalist?
Notepad and pen. And a dictaphone in my reporting days, like an old school proper dictaphone. I would never rely on just my phone.
What's your favourite thing to do to unwind after a long day at work?
Cook. Cook definitely, and also watch the cooking channel. If I've had a very, very hard long day of edits, I just put the cooking channel on and I just sort of zone out.
What's an article that you're most proud of for either editing or writing?
Oh, good one. I think thinking back to when I was still a reporter, one of the things I was most proud of was an investigation I did about abuse in gymnastics. Well, a series of investigations and reporting I did on that. Yeah, it was really hard and emotionally really, really challenging. But I remain really, really proud of that, and I hope that all the reporting at the time that everybody did on different publications can change the sport for the better.
So that is the end of the quickfire round. You did very well. So we are going to end today's podcast on the question that we always end the podcast on, and that is, what is one piece of advice you'd give to someone at the Boar now?
Read as much as you can. If you want to be a journalist and if you want to write, read as much as you possibly can. But also enjoy it would be my top. It's a special thing to do, and a special place to work, and have fun, enjoy it. Yeah, I still look back so fondly, and yeah, and I did treasure it when I was there. But if you're not doing that already, do it.
We hope you enjoyed listening to our conversation with Rebecca as much as we enjoyed having it. Rebecca told us so many fascinating stories, and we can't wait to see what her next step in journalism is.
Whether you've listened to this episode preparing for Freshers Week, or maybe you found the podcast since meeting up with us during Freshers Week, we hope you're excited for the year ahead. Keep an eye out on all the Boar social media pages for all the exciting opportunities coming up, including deputy editor applications, which will be opening soon.
You can also read all the latest articles at www.theboar.org and check out all the latest updates about the podcast on Instagram at Hogging the Mic.
We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks' time on the 9th of October. So for now, enjoy Freshers Week and good luck settling back in at Warwick for the new academic year.